Hi, I'm Jared the Wyrd-Worker, and I've been practicing witchcraft for just over 2 decades. In this video, I'd like to talk about how I got started in witchcraft and my personal recommendations to those who might be looking to get started as well. This video was inspired by a request by Sarah Ann over on Twitter. I will note that my recommendations are going to be heavily influenced by my own practice, which is both theistic and spiritualistic in nature. My practice of witchcraft is deeply rooted in the relationship I have with Freya and working with other spirits and entities, and some of my recommendations are founded on the assumption that you will be forming your own relationships with deities and or spirits of some kind. If that's not the kind of witchcraft that you're interested in, and it's perfectly valid if you're an atheist or secular witch, this video may be of limited use and interest to you. Fortunately for you, there are a bunch of other witches on YouTube, and I'm sure many of them have videos that approach witchcraft from a non-theistic, non-spiritualist framework. I ended up reading Scott Cunningham's book, Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner, because a Wiccan friend recommended it when I said I wanted to learn more about her religion. At that time, I was also dealing with the pain and trauma that my upbringing in evangelical Christianity had caused me, and I knew I needed to make some changes that would allow me to heal and rebuild my sense of personal value. I found that reading Wicca, and I found that Cunningham's description of magic and what it was like resonated with me greatly. I remembered how I've always imagined what it would feel like if I could feel the flow of magic around me, and here was a book that said it wasn't just my imagination, it was real. I ended up dedicating myself to a Wiccan path almost immediately. In hindsight, that was probably brash of me, since I quickly realized I wasn't Wiccan after all. Granted, even before I realized it, I didn't agree or like everything Cunningham said. At first, I had an issue with the whole God and Goddess thing. I had grown up as an evangelical Christian, and my concept of the divine was such that I told myself I didn't see it as having any gender. The idea of splitting the divine into 2 or more deities that had gender bothered me greatly. Needless to say, my views on the divine have changed since then, as I now primarily work with a goddess, but I still disagree with the way Cunningham describes the divine in his book. The exact details of my disagreement have now changed. This brings me to my first bit of advice. I think it is essential to read and learn. If I were to recommend a book, I would recommend either The Inner Temple of Witchcraft by Christopher Penczak or the Wicca book by Cunningham. I'm more inclined to recommend the Penczak book because it includes recommended exercises to work through as you read through it. I'll talk more about recommendations about practices later in this video. But I recommend that no matter what book you choose to read, and there are other choices beyond the 2 I've mentioned, you make it the only witchcraft book you read at first. Note that phrase, at first. I agree with everyone else that warns against relying on a single source for information in general. But when you're starting, I think it's good to spend time with your first book and focus on it so you can really engage with it. By engaging with it, I mean take your time to read through it and actually think about what you're reading. Journal about what you're reading. Talk with other people, preferably people who aren't one true wayist about witchcraft and aren't completely hostile toward the book you're reading, and talk to them about what you're reading. Think, write, and talk about what really resonates with you in the book. Do the same thing with the parts that don't make sense to you or even seem wrong to you. Yes, you get to disagree with senior witches even when you're just starting out, because your witchcraft may be strikingly different from theirs. Yours might be completely different, and part of this process is figuring out what your witchcraft all looks like. Also, focusing on a single book will hopefully keep you from feeling too overwhelmed. I see a lot of newer witches talk about how they feel overwhelmed by how much there is to learn. And I've been there myself. I'll let you in on 2 important secrets when it comes to how much there is to learn. The first secret is you don't have to learn everything overnight. You don't even have to learn everything in your first year. I've been a witch now for over 2 decades, and there are still mountains of things I haven't learned. Which leads me to the second secret. You don't have to learn everything anyway. You can be an amazing witch and never learn anything about herbs or spirit communication. Heck, I'll probably never know more about ceremonial magic beyond the very basics that I picked up when I looked into it just long enough to figure out that ceremonial magic wasn't for me. After a few months, I realized Wicca wasn't really for me, so I started exploring Druidry because I had made a friend who was part of a Druid fellowship, and he and his mentor were willing to teach me and guide me. I stuck with that for about a year or so before the same friend started listening to me talk about the runes. I had been studying the runes even before I read Cunningham's book. He noted the passion I demonstrated as I talked about the runes and the lore, which is deeply rooted in Norse mythology and culture, that they draw on. He suggested, rather emphatically, that I should pursue a relationship with the Norse deities, and I joined the Troth for about a year or so. I think the most important takeaway from this part of my story is that you should never be afraid to course correct, nor should you be afraid to make what may be a wrong turn when you're starting out. Those are not really wrong turns, more like detours. You can learn from those. Learning that a given path, practice, or belief is wrong for you, and then seeking to understand why that is wrong for you, often turns out to be an amazing bit of self-understanding. This also means that you would be wise not to be too quick to make serious commitments. Don't pledge yourself to be part of something or do something until you've taken the time to make sure you are prepared to follow through and want to do so. Again, in retrospect, dedicating myself to Wicca so quickly after reading my first book was a mistake. Fortunately, it didn't cost much for me to seek to be released from that pledge, so take your time. It's okay to make a more tentative commitment at first. One of the positive things that came out of my time with both a Druid Fellowship and the Troth is that both organizations stress the importance of studying mythology, which I greatly enjoyed and I think is essential to the craft I practice. The one book I would actually recommend you read at the same time as your first witchcraft book is a mythology book. If you have an idea of what pantheon or specific deity or deities you're most drawn to and would like to work with, then by all means, pick a mythology book that focuses on them. Consider what these myths tell you about them. Consider what they might be teaching you. If you haven't picked a deity or have no idea who you might be drawn to, be looking at, okay, who does attract your attention? Whose myths attract your attention? And do the same thing with any other spirits or entities you're considering working with, reading any lore you can find about them. If you're into fairies and you think you might want to work with fairy magic, start learning fairy lore. While I was also trying to find my spiritual home, I was learning and practicing basic skills that I consider essential to any practice of witchcraft, magic, or mysticism. I was learning to enter and maintain a meditative state. I was learning to visualize and hold a visualization in my mind. As an aside, the Fat Feminist Witch has a wonderful podcast episode on visualization, which is very helpful. Mainly, I like it because she discusses how visualization as a term for the practice is misleading. Visualization is not limited to seeing things. The other senses can and should be involved. I'll include a link to that podcast episode down in the description for this video because I think it's good to check it out. I was also learning to sense and manipulate energy, develop my intuition, ground, center, and shield myself. These are all basic skills that every witch, magician, and mystic, okay, maybe mystics don't need to know how to sense or manipulate energy, should learn and practice. Each of them is pretty simple. Most of them are covered in the exercises of the Inner Temple of Witchcraft, and there are many YouTube videos on each of them. You merely need to practice them over time. That's something you can and should start immediately. Making offerings to the deities, spirits, and entities you hope to eventually work with is also a good idea. If you have a specific deity in mind, try to find out what they might like as an offering and go with that. For example, if you're like me and into Freya, mead or amber incense are both great choices. If not, and you don't know who you might want to work with, make an offering to the deities in general, or the divine, or the god and goddess as you see fit. A bit of food will do, or simply light an incense and invite the deities to accept it as a gift in honor of them. Similarly, it can be helpful to pray to deities, either specific ones or just the divine in general. You can write and recite poetry to them. You can write and sing songs honoring them. The idea here is to simply acknowledge them and honor them. At this point, you don't want to start asking them for things, nor do you want to start dedicating yourself to them or making promises to them. Generally speaking, deities expect you to keep the promises you make to them. So that's something to hold off until you're really sure that you want to follow through with that dedication. Right now, you just want to let them know that you're thinking of them and that you respect them. They'll take note. And hopefully, it will incline them to look favorably on you when you are ready to take your connection to them to the next level. Of course, it also may cause them to take an interest in you, and maybe they'll let you know when it's time to take it to the next level, even before you think you're ready. That's probably something to be discussed in another video. So let me know about your experiences getting started and what advice you'd offer others in the comments. And be sure to check back next week when I will be talking about planning and constructing rites and rituals. Until then, blessed be.